autoregulation, the idea of autoregulation, everybody in here, we're in a gym, I know everybody trains, right? At some point you have to decide what training loads you're going to use on the day, okay? Whether that training load is predetermined or whether that training load is determined on varying factors of preparedness and anything that would influence your actual ability to do work on the day, okay? Autoregulation is going to include the fluid manipulation of training variables throughout the training process. This is the autoregulation book of methods. There's two sides to autoregulation. We have subjective indicators. How many people know what an Rpe is? I know. Yeah, all right, cool. All our lifters. Okay. Rpe asks a question. Okay. If you don't know, Rpe stands for rating of perceived exertion. Initially, Rpe was not coined for training. It was for medicine. Okay. Rating of perceived experience. Okay. We measured taste, sound, various sensations through the medical process. Okay. We've since adapted that into the training process, and a lot of that we can thank Mike T for, Mike Tashir. Okay. Most people are going to be familiar with the Tashir model of the Rpe, which is a numbered scale that we'll get into soon. Reps in reserve, very similar. Ask a question, okay? Subjective indicators, regardless of what it is, ask a question of difficulty, velocity, exertion, or any other factor that you want to determine. On the other side of that coin, we have objective indicators, okay? Objectively, I can't answer that question because it's all coming from me, right? A coach might be able to objectively answer that, but even then there's still some subjectivity in that, okay? The only way to auto-regulate training load objectively is through velocity, okay? You could make the case for doing AMRAPs as an objective measure. You go to complete failure, that's what you do, okay? You can't do anymore. That's an objective measure, okay? The reason you got to failure, maybe some subjectiveness, maybe it was technique, maybe it was physical fatigue, we don't know, okay? So objective indicators and subjective indicators, very important for the rest of the talk. Into the rating of perceived exertion. So most of you, everybody raised their hand that they were familiar with the Rpe scale, okay? Few know where it was originally created at. The Borg scale was one of the first introductions of the Rpe scale, and it's obviously a much broader range than the Tashir scale, if you're familiar with it. The Borg scale was somewhere between 1 to 20, and it measured perceptions of exertion, mostly in aerobic training, okay? So you can think the varying degrees of difficulty through the course of a 5-mile run for a moderate advanced runner would vary quite frequently as the run progressed, right? Because of the duration is longer than a set of 5 on the squat, okay? Or a set of 10 or what have you. The Tashir model was developed for lifters. It's much smaller. It's generally 3 points, maybe 4 points, 7 to 10, okay? Both scales, if you were to use them for weight training, would ask the question of how many more could you have done, okay? At 10 RPE, you had no more in the tank. 9, you had 1, and so forth down the scale. Now, objectively, we can't answer that question on our own. We can have a coach do it, we might be able to have input from a training partner, but objectively, we can't answer it. We can get really close, and there's been studies that have confirmed this, but we cannot objectively say, yes, this was this exactly all of the time. There's too many factors that go into it. Whether or not those factors are meaningful and how much do they actually influence the overall training effect, that's to be debated. Objectively, we can use velocity and reps to failure as a measure, okay? So velocity, how many in here have ever used a velocity measuring device or have an idea of what velocity is related to the training process? Few, yeah, it's a newer thing, right? So velocity, we hook it to a bar and it tells us exactly how fast that bar moved, okay? There's no ifs, ands, or buts. That's exactly how fast it moved, okay? There might be some subjectiveness on why it moved that fast. Maybe your technique was bad. Maybe you're fatiguing fast, okay? Those are questions to ask. But objectively, we get a measure from the device, and that's the measure no matter what, okay? So the difference, velocity is going to be relative to the percentage of load that you're using, okay? How many people have trained on a percentage-based training program? One day you have 80% for 5 reps, okay, and that's what you have to do. Well, how do you decide if that feels heavy? How do you decide if that's too light, right? We need to ask these questions. Is this load appropriate for the day that we're training on? Is this load accomplishing the goals that we wanted? Whether or not we wrote this training block out 5 weeks ago, maybe external factors came in on that day. Maybe you had to sit in traffic for 3 hours and you had your pre-workout as soon as you left work, right? You're probably toast by the time that you actually get to training. So you can imagine there's many factors that obviously, if you're watching this or you're here now, you know the many factors that affect the training process on a day-to-day basis, okay? Velocity accounts for that. All of these account for that, okay? But velocity, if we're using a percentage-based program, that 80% is now fluid, right? It's no longer a fixed 225 pounds, 500 pounds. It's a fluid measure based on daily preparedness, okay? Like all other measures are, but other measures are not efficient at correlating percentage of 1 rep max and an autoregulation measure, okay? It's very difficult to blend subjective measures in the training process unless you build, this might go on a little bit of a tangent, but unless you build a percentage exertion profile, which takes a lot of work, you have to go to a failure a lot in training in order to do that, okay? Velocity, we can map your warm-up sets up to an appropriate load, take that distribution, and use that as your velocity profile, okay? Your velocity profile is a lot like your fingerprint. It's individual to the user. Unlike your fingerprint, it might change a little over time, but overall, it's going to be highly individualized to the athlete using it. There might be similarities in demographic from athlete to athlete, but largely, it's going to be very unique to you, okay? So this is important. For one, we cannot use a standardized chart for everybody. We know that some people squat fast, some people squat slow. Likewise for all the lifts, okay? All lifts have different velocities that they move at as well. Velocity is number 1, movement specific, number 2, load specific, okay? Each movement is gonna have a different velocity profile up to a certain point, okay? So if you follow, velocity now correlates percentage of 1 rep max to an autoregulated factor that we can adjust load on, okay? Another interesting aside, if we take a velocity profile of the competition style bench press, right? We bench with a pause, we profile that velocity. Can we now use those same velocities on a close grip press? Probably not exactly, but we can use a zone, okay? Velocity zones, the way we use them for the Kabuki strength clients, are gonna be a 5% range, okay? So instead of having a finite percentage, we now have a range of anywhere from 5 to 7% that we can say, work in this load, okay? Adaptation is not so specific that we need a single percentage to use for everything. We can get a very specific training effect from working within a range, and that's what the velocity zones attempt to do. The farther you get away from the profiled lift that you did, for example, you profiled your competition bench press, we probably cannot use that for an overhead press. There's simply too many factors that go into the different lifts to be able to use. Okay, velocity profiles, I just touched on that. Here's the slide. This is what it looks like. Obviously, we can see a very even distribution of data points, and that's gonna be crucial to ensure the accuracy of your actual profile. All right, to wrap it up, which one should you choose, okay? Why is one better than the other? There's many factors that would influence this. Novice lifters are likely not best suited to go straight to RPE training or subjective measures of training. The simple fact that a new lifter thinks that everything's hard or thinks that everything is moderately challenging. They don't have a refined scale to say, this was easy, this was hard. Because if we take a step back, everything's hard, right? Everything feels difficult. Well, how difficult does it feel? There's skill that goes into quantifying that and rating that in your scale. So again, this slide right here, this is more of my anecdotal opinion based on people that I've worked with. RPE, if you want to use it for a novice lifter, you're best suited to only record your RPE first before actually using it to determine training loads. For example, you train with 80% on a day, you ask the client or athlete or yourself to record how difficult it was with an RPE. Through that process, they're going to learn what's easy, what's hard, and they're going to have to challenge themselves week to week to re-identify that RPE. AMRAPs, very appropriate for novice lifters. One, they don't have a lot of force potential, right? One of the big downsides for AMRAP training for advanced lifters is they can mess themselves up, right? Advanced lifters have a very high degree of force potential that if you were to do AMRAP training very, very frequently on complex lifts, technique might affect this, but they're going to sustain a lot more damage than a novice lifter would. For that fact, AMRAPs should be very strategically placed in an advanced lifters program. Intermediate lifters, now again, these descriptions of novice, advanced, intermediate, totally subjective. Okay, probably comes down to years training, but you can determine that for yourself. Intermediate lifters, again, AMRAPs, they can be appropriate, similar to novices, but with a little more consideration where they're at. If you've already been using RPEs and recording them on your own, this is a good time to start implementing them into your training. Now, you don't have to be a certain strength level to start doing this. You just need to have a certain amount of time that you've used these, okay? So you identify or adapt a skill in your ratings. Okay, velocity is very appropriate for intermediate lifters. Novice lifters, velocity somewhat appropriate, but movement variability influences velocity a lot. Okay, if you are all over the place in your technique, velocity will reflect that. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, even though the velocity might say you can't. It means that the movement variability from rep to rep in a technique of a novice lifter might not be appropriate for a really exact measure of bar velocity. Advanced lifters, this is assuming that they're seasoned lifters, they've been doing this a long time. Again, AMRAP training may be strategically placed, must serve a purpose, maybe at the end of a training block before a deload, or maybe if you're only training one, maybe two lifts throughout the course of your microcycle. Okay, advanced lifters obviously very appropriate to use velocity. Advanced lifters are typically very efficient in their technique, so velocity becomes even that much more accurate. RPE is very appropriate for an advanced lifter. Again, it depends on the skill base of it. If an advanced lifter has never used RPE before and I say, how hard was that? It's going to be difficult for them to actually quantify that. So, in closing, these are the various methods of subjective, objective autoregulation and who they are appropriate for. Do you guys have any questions?
How many of those do you use in your training protocols?
Good question. We use them all. So there's a place for all of these. For our clientele, our virtual coaching clientele, all of them use velocity for their main lifts. You cannot use velocity for machines. Okay? We still need to tell people how to use or what loads to choose on machines, isolation movements, non-profile lifts, far variants of the profile lifts. For those, we use the reps in reserve scale. Okay? Reps in reserve is very similar to RPE, but in my opinion, it's a little more intuitive. Okay? So instead of saying, was that a 7, 8, or 9, we say, leave 1 in the tank, leave 2 in the tank. So that skips a step in actually rating. You can debate on which one is better or worse. This is the one that we prefer. But for competition lifts, main lifts, close variants, we use velocity. For isolation movements, machines, non-specific lifts, we use reps in reserve, and AMRAPs are strategically placed if we so choose that we need them. And that can be very individualized.
Do you collect and use subjective feedback as well?
Yes, yes, so we do, yeah. So this could get into a huge other discussion, but we do collect subjective feedback as well. So subjective feedback is very important, one from the coaching standpoint, to ensure that the training load you are giving is appropriate. Excuse me. From the client standpoint, it forces them to consistently validate how difficult something is. And largely we see that more often when an athlete is exposed to a hard stimulus, those hard stimuluses generally become easier over time. So these are important things to track. The subjective ratings that we include for our athletes that we require from them are 1 to 5 scale, easy to pushing the limit. And this is a way for us to more accurately build the training plan.
What feedback do you usually get from virtual coaching clients who come from a static or passive, training program where they just follow a set reps, set scheme to going into an auto-regulated program?
One of the biggest things that that we find is a better enjoyment of training. So it can be really difficult to come into the gym and do 6 sets of 8 at like 75%. Do the same load for all of them. It's a lot of reps. It's a lot of really difficult sets, okay? Those sets are not all static in their performance, right? Some of those sets are going to be highly better performed. Some are going to be underperformed. How do we account for that, okay? And that's what auto-regulation does. You can still use a percentage-based program and auto-regulate it. You just have to use the right measure. RPE is challenging to do with that. Velocity is not. So, in my opinion, the thing that we've seen the most is just a bigger enjoyment of training. Likely, it's difficult to quantify results because we can't control the two populations, but obviously the results of our clientele speak for themselves.
Speaking of results, what do you see a difference from clients coming that have solely experience with RPE or subjective measures to using velocity?
That's also a very good question. So a lot of times, and this is kind of dependent on the psychology of the lifter, but more often than not, people coming from a completely auto-regulated background from the subjective side, RPE, reps in reserve, they're using that for everything, we find that they aren't pushing themselves hard enough. Now again, this kind of goes back to the psychology of it. So really aggressive lifters might push themselves too hard in a subjective-based program. Lifters who aren't as aggressive probably don't push themselves as hard. Velocity accounts for both of those. So the nice thing about velocity is it keeps you honest, no matter what. All right. Thank you for sitting down and listening to this presentation.
Thanks, Brandon.